What's up? What's up? What's up? Welcome back to the God Squad. We are live on another Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we got friends at the house. We got company. We got guests. But first of all, what's up, Dillon Desimber Cruz? What's up?
The world is crazy, and I'm pissed off about it. that's what's up. That's what's up. But I am glad to see some familiar faces tonight on the show with us, and so that's cool.
That's right.
That makes
That's
it a little bit better.
The world is a little bit better. It's at least 2 times better with these two people here. So we got the Keith Giles and the Matthew Distefano, choir authors of the new release, Reading Romans Right. Because, of course, we've been reading that thing wrong. And so we need to know how to read it right. And I'm excited that they are with us. But before we jump into the book, because we're going to jump all the way in, ankles, knees, and shoulders deep. But before we do that, how y'all holding up under this tax increase that we are in confronted with today?
I'll tell you in 30 days, because we'll see. We'll see how bad it really is. But within a few hours of him announcing it, right, yesterday, the stock market just started doing a nosedive. So today's not much better. I'm just waiting. I can't believe. I don't know. I just can't believe it could last too much longer. But it could be a long haul. We'll see. We'll just have to wait and see.
We will see what happens. The market is in him right now.
I think we know what's going to happen, and I posed the question on TikTok today. I haven't made a TikTok in a while because I heard they're going to ban it, I guess, again. I said, anyone who supports Trump, please answer this for me. Why aren't you drinking Trump water? Why aren't you playing Trump board game when you're around with your family? Why aren't you eating Trump steaks? Why aren't you flying Trump airlines? Why aren't you gambling at Trump Casino? Why aren't you donating to the Trump Foundation?
Why aren't you at Trump University?
Because it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So how is he going to run this thing like a business? Where do you think his businesses end up?
Yep.
So now we're here, and anyone who is arguing, like, you might as well just let me come up and slap you in the face and tell you why it's for your benefit. and some people will argue that tooth and nail with a bruised face, telling me why I needed Matt to slap me. I needed that. That was good. That was for me.
Thank you, sir. May I have another?
Please, sir.
Right.
Can I have another?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Unfortunately, and that's what people are doing. And it's funny how they're spinning it. Like somebody called it a detox. I never heard of a Trump, a tariff being referred to, or a tax, or a recession, or a stock market crash being referred to as a detox.
Then let the billionaires feel some of the pain, because they don't care about egg prices. They don't care about, if you got a detox from some sort of system, so-called, then let the people who don't even care about egg prices, because that's all they want to talk about for a second. Now we got a detox from some sort of system that doesn't work for us. Fine. Capitalism does suck, but your solution to have us fit the pain and punishment while they don't even live in reality. So spare us when you're the oligarchs telling us what things are going to be like.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Well, no historian thinks that these tariffs are a good idea, because they can go back and look at the historical record, and it's plain as day. Shit went sideways when they enacted the tariffs under McKinley and the Hoot-Smalley tariff and all of that. And it created a gilded age in the 1890s in which most of the people were suffering, and then the very extremely wealthy class was making bank. And that's the kind of thing that they want to do. And Timothy Snyder said, the Yale historian, who's now going to be moving to Toronto because of the brazen fascism, he said the whole idea behind all of this is to absolutely destroy everything for the oligarchs.
Yes.
Who gets to buy it for pennies on the dollar?
Exactly. They can afford to buy stocks for pennies now.
I actually believe that, because how can you tear up an entire nation's economy in 3 months, in less than 3 months, unless it's intentional?
That's exactly.
They're tariffing an island full of
effort to do that.
They're tariffing an island full of penguins. They know what the fuck these people.
I heard about that. I was
like little tiny suits. They're just going to tariff that 10% that they ship out of that country.
Listen,
that no one lives. Zero people.
Listen,
live on
those
island.
those penguins had better watch it. Okay,
they've really screwed America for the last time.
This is the last tap dance they done.
That's
with
right.
Their happy feet, okay.
If those penguins ever come up with an economy and form some kind of a government, they better be prepared to pay some tariffs.
You suit wearing motherfuckers.
Preemptive tariffs.
Did y'all hear how they came up with the numbers that they started?
No. Tell me.
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh.
They don't have any basis in reality.
Okay.
They just divided some numbers and then attributed to a trade deficit that wasn't actually the thing, and then just said that's what we're going to do it. So Trump's been claiming that Europe tariffs the United States at 39%. It's actually 3%.
They don't even
he's saying it's damn near 40.
Yeah.
So these people are not only fascist, but they're fucking idiots.
Yes, they're stupid. They're stupid fascists. Yes.
I'm so sick of this timeline. I mean,
I'm ready. I'm ready for another one. I can take Scotty. Beam me up. I'm ready. Please get me out of here.
Well, I do know that.
Sorry, what is that term where it's like stupid people run shit? What's the term?
Kakistocracy.
That's the one.
Yeah. Well, I do know that all around the country this Saturday, April 5th, there are going to be protests everywhere.
I will be there. I will be at the one in El Paso. Wendy and I have gone to 3 of them here locally in El Paso. And so now I got my signs ready. I'm ready to go. I know where to go. I see the same people all the time now. I will be down there on Saturday in El Paso, downtown.
Well, I hope a lot of people are, but even some Republicans are starting to get pissed because, spoiler alert, the president doesn't have the power to impose tariffs.
Right.
That's Congress.
Right.
I thought they had the power of the purse, is what I grew up believing.
But they handed it off for free. Right? They just gave it away to Musk, who wasn't even an elected official. They're letting this guy do their job, and they're happy about it. I don't even understand it.
Well, the Senate is pushing back at least some, but with Mike Johnson being Speaker of the House, that there's God only knows, all bets are off there.
Yeah. Yeah, you saw that, right, Dillon? I was talking to Matt about that earlier today, but I couldn't remember the details. Like something in the Senate where even some Republicans in the Senate, had some resolution or something that they did about the tariffs, right? They
tried to get Canada, and four Republicans joined them, trying to basically exempt Canada from this for certain. Of course,
Yeah, it won't work, right? Because like the House isn't going to do anything. So
no, and then Trump will veto it. It's not like he's going to pass it.
Exactly. Exactly.
But hopefully, there's going to be enough resistance because at some point, these elected officials have to go back to their constituents.
Mm-hmm,
yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, when they do, they get beat up at these town halls.
Oh yeah. So at some point, there's going to be a collision. I just can't imagine that every Republican is on board with this shit. Because again, no economist thinks this is a good idea unless they're, a sycophant for Trump. No historian thinks this is a good idea that I've seen. And certainly no consumer thinks it's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's why it awakens the conspiracy theorist in me. Like he's got to be doing this shit on purpose. Like what's he trying? Like not even him, but the powers that be. It's almost like they talk about a deep state for long enough, and now they fucking got one. They were admitting their shit the whole time. And now, like, the powers that be are really trying to fuck this shit up because no one thinks this is a good idea. Not one. I watch the most annoyingly apolitical financial people. They're like, this is a terrible idea. Yes. And they won't stand for nothing politically. They won't stand. They don't care about the grab and buy the you-know-what. They don't care about none of that. They don't care about the political stuff. They don't care about the deportations. They don't care about the racism, nothing. They talk strictly in finances. They're like, And then they're like, no one thinks this is a good idea economically.
Craig said Trump will do his own thing regardless, and I have to agree with that.
Yeah.
It's part of his narcissistic ego personality. He has this thing in his mind that he's this all-powerful being that's inflicting tariffs across the world. He still cannot accept that tariffs are taxes on the people in your own country. Someone flat out asked him that question, presented that to him in the White House, and he refused to answer that. Do you remember that? There was a reporter.
Yeah.
And you could always tell when he's on that bullshit because he'll ask the reporter, what network are they from?
Yeah, exactly. Where are you from?
Won't answer the question.
Yeah. And
he'll be like,
insult them.
who are you with?
Who are you with?
It's a $3,800 tax on the average American is what the number is.
Yeah.
So $3,800
That's 300 something a month.
Of your money is going to concentrate wealth.
Yeah.
To richer people.
Whatever you make, whatever you make a month, minus it by 300 something.
So I'll just stop reading.
Trump says everything is going great. He's either manipulating the market or just plain dumb. Two things can be true.
That's right.
Two things can be true.
He can't be dumb.
Manipulating the market, and he is just plain dumb. Those things are not mutually exclusive.
That's right.
Yeah, he's evil and he's dumber than a box of fucking hammers.
And that's a really terrible combination. It really is.
Yeah,
it really is. To be evil and to be dumb at the same time is catastrophic. Apparently,
yeah,
it's impressive too.
Yeah,
it is pretty impressive in the worst way. It's terribly, tragically impressive.
And you only laugh because you don't want to spend every second of every day dying and crying.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
You gotta find some kind of humor in it. Lisa Stratton said, "Hey Lisa, hey girl, hey." Lisa says it was heartbreaking week in the ATL with so many losses. Again, they laid out, it was like 10,000 people.
Something ridiculous.
At the CDC. People are losing their 401ks. They had interviewed a couple today. I was watching some news broadcast and they said they lost 6 figures out of their retirement fund today. I was like, damn, I just wish I had
in
6
one day
figures to start with.
I don't even have 6 figures or a retirement fund.
It only went down 4%. Now you got me apologizing for how it's not that 4%. Damn, how much you got in there?
Yeah. Okay, because I was like, damn, what you got? I just let me have 4%.
That's like a humble brag. Damn, I lost 6 figures today. Like what?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, okay, a baller, shot caller, brawler, whatever, I wish I just had the portion you lost. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no kidding. I take that.
Let me just have some crumbs off the table. But anyhow, we are here the reason why we got these two wonderful souls with us today is because they have recently put another masterpiece in the atmosphere. Reading Romans Right. Y'all see it. It is available right now on Amazon. Y'all need to go get it. Because apparently they want to inform all of us that we've been reading Romans wrong all this time. And so they are correcting the common misreadings and restoring Paul's original intent in this book. These two kings before you, Matthew Distefano and Keith Giles, brother Keith and Deacon Distefano on the set right now. So first of all, how did this come to be? Is my first question. What made you wake up one day and say, these motherfuckers are reading Romans wrong? I think we need to write a book called Reading Romans Right. And we need to tell the people and learn them something about Paul. What made you wake up and decide that you want to do Reading Romans Right together?
Together, it kind of just happens where Keith and I, we worked together for a long time, on Heretic Happy Hour and God Squad and all this going back. We never wrote a book together. And then it just kind of happens. But as far as Romans, I remember thinking back, the first time I ran into my friends they almost had their own deconstruction, but they deconstructed from evangelical to Reformed Calvinist, and they got really into Romans, and they really started going hard in this the wrath of God stuff, and you're predestined to burn in hell, and some are predestined to go to heaven, and all this stuff. It was very rigid. I remember and And then when I found out that there's like a bunch of different ways to read Romans, and I remember being like really passionate about that, especially since I'm not straight. Like that gets beaten over our head all the time. Romans 1, Romans 1, 26 and 27. And so I always wanted to, like, if I ever wrote a book just about a book of the Bible, it was that one, because I feel like that one is like a bludgeon. That's like, everything looks like a nail, so you use that hammer, and that's the hammer of justice of God that people use, and they just smack you over the head of it. They use other books too, but Romans was really one of them.
Yeah.
And then it was like, Keith and I kind of felt the same way. So it was like, well, why don't we write it together and see if we don't fight about it? And it was good. It was a smooth process.
It was very smooth. Yeah, it was a really smooth process. Yeah, just like Matt, I'm the same way. Where as I went through my deconstruction process, I came across this really wonderful progressive Bible teacher that really opened my eyes to Romans and what was going on in Romans, things that I'd never noticed before. And then when I went to check it out for myself, because it was like, whoa, this is pretty radical. And I started doing my own research and stuff and looking into other scholars and what Paul's really doing in Romans. And then frankly, just reading it myself, like a lot of the problems were solved by just like turning to Romans chapter 1 and reading it straight through, like 1, 2, 3, just read through the chapters. And you start noticing, like if you follow the train of thought, like Paul's not saying what I was told it was saying for a very long time. So, it just really bothered me, and it bothered Matt as well. As we talked, both found out we both had the same kind of like, sort of pet peeve. Like it really bothers me to hear people, especially Reformed Christians, the Gospel Coalition, those guys, and a lot of conservative evangelical theologians and pastors and Bible teachers acting as if Romans, they use Romans all the time to justify misogyny, homophobia, eternal conscious torment and predestination and allegiance to the state, Romans 13, right? I actually, and you might remember this, Dillon, I don't know if you guys remember this. Was it Jeff Sessions when he was Attorney General? I forgot what the issue was, but there was something going on at the time, and they were asking Jeff Sessions about it, and he responded by quoting Romans 13 about how God has, made the state the minister, God's minister, and basically just we should all submit to what.
It wasn't during the Obama years, though.
No, it wasn't. No, it was just during Trump's previous
not.
term. During Trump's previous term. And so when you start noticing those kind of things, like, man, Romans is getting abused and misquoted and misused to teach all kinds of stuff that Paul did not mean. So yeah, Matt and I just decided, let's write this book together. I've never written a book with anyone before. Matt has, but this is the first book I've ever co-written with somebody else. And it was really a lot of fun. It was great for me because I only had to write half a book. So, I can write half a book all day long. That was fun.
Well, you already write a full book every day.
Yeah.
I was actually getting ready to ask you, how was the experience of writing it with each other? How did the vision come together?
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, Keith actually teaches a course on writing books and getting started and getting to the finish line. He has some awesome courses about it. You should look him up on all the social media platforms, and also Choir offers those courses through Choir Publishing.
Choir Academy. Online course. Yeah.
How was it with coming together on the concept and marrying the visions that each of you had, because both of you have different personalities, and so how was it to bringing the process together to marry the vision that you both had? And were there any times where you had a difference of interpretation of something that you read, and do you cover that in the book? Where is there a time where you're like, that ain't what Paul said, and you was like, that is exactly what Paul said, you missed it. You know what I'm saying? So was there any time where there was a clash of understanding, or were you pretty much in alignment with each other on the direction of this book and your interpretation of who Paul is and what he intended to convey in the book of Romans? And also, there's always been a debate about which books Paul in fact did write.
That's right.
I don't believe that. I do believe that Romans is one of the ones where it's settled that Paul
Yes.
in fact wrote.
Yes.
Pretty
But there's
sure he
others
wrote
where it's
100%.
not.
Yes.
Yes.
It's all Paul. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we had like, for like the overall vision we kind of agreed on. There were some instances where there's a verse here and a passage there that we might think, hey, this is Paul quoting his opponent, this is not. And our emphasis was always to say, like, this is what the scholars who argue this stuff say.
Yeah.
And so there was not going to be for us, like, we're not Pauline scholars. We're just trying to, Keith says, like, take the cookies off the top shelf or take them down from the top shelf. That's Keith's phrase. I'm just quoting him.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, Keith, I think this is wrong. And it's not really me. It's like, this is kind of what the scholars are saying.
Yeah.
And neither of us, which was good, neither of us were like gonna die on all these hills. And I know some people, when they're writing, which is surprising, like, I can be pretty opinionated, especially with my process. So I was happy that with Keith it worked really well, because I know I can get a little feisty, and that never happened because we were both like willing to concede and say, hey, we can still make our point without having to die here on this verse and this verse. And I think we can be a little more ambiguous on some of the overall specificities, because that's not our goal. Like, we don't need to put forth a 1,000-page thesis and we have to quote the Greek exact and do everything. We're just looking at like the overall picture here and to say, hey, this is the overall message, and there's wiggle room within it, of course.
Yeah. The time he's talking about, and I'll talk about something that Matt wrote that I sort of stepped in on, but what he's talking about is, so as far as I know, these are the only two, the only two places where, and it was very, very mild. So we were going through, like, one of the arguments and we're making in the book, and we didn't make this up. We're really quoting other biblical scholars like Douglas Campbell and David Bentley Hart and some others. But one of the things that when people read Romans wrong, most of the time it's because they don't understand that Paul is using, for a good chunk of the letter, he's using an argumentation technique from the first century called prosopopoeia, which is a sort of a mock debate between himself and an opponent. And he's speaking for the opponent, and then he'll answer the opponent, and then the opponent will speak, and then he'll counter the argument. But if you don't understand that back and forth is going on, you just read it all as Paul. It's all Paul talking. And that's where we get into a lot of trouble with theology, right? So I was writing, my assignment was writing one of those sections. And when I turned it in to let Matt look at it, he said, hey, one of these verses, you have it in the voice of the opponent. And I think that's actually Paul talking. Or not that he thought it. He said, actually, Douglas Campbell, who is like the big time scholar, who really is a Pauline scholar, he says, that it should be the other way around. And in that case, I didn't argue. Like, who am I? All right, I'm not going to say no. Douglas Campbell is wrong. So I'm like, okay, all right, let's change that. Put it back. That's fine.
I appealed to authority. Forgive me.
And I submitted.
And that's a legitimate
to
appeal to authority. Yeah,
exactly.
I thought so.
now, but Matt wrote, when he was writing his section, and he showed it to me,
and I stand by it.
And I know you stand by it. But the look, part of what we were trying to do, if you've read the book, you'll notice this. What we're trying to do is, we don't want you to be able to tell when Keith is writing something versus when Matt is writing something. We wanted the voices to blend very well together, so you wouldn't be distracted by, oh, Keith is talking or Matt is talking, or even asking that question. Like, you would just be focused on whatever the argument is, right? So there was a certain thing that Matt had written, and he pulled in a reference to Kendrick Lamar. And I said, I think this is really great, but I don't think our audience is really going to necessarily, like, you're reading a book about Romans and theology and all that. I don't think Kendrick Lamar is going to really fit here. And so
I can see the editorial point, but I stand by what I said.
Yeah.
Let's just put it this way: if you wrote whole book by
it's not in the book.
yourself,
We'll just say it's not in the book.
Yeah, but if you wrote this book by yourself, Matt, that would have stayed in there.
No, my editor would have probably pulled it out.
Oh, okay, all right.
Well, I did read the book this week. I read the whole thing this week, and I thought y'all did a good job at keeping it so where I would say 95% of the time, I wasn't sure whose voice I was reading. There were a couple of spots where I was like, "That's Matt,"
But you know Matt too, so.
But for the most part, I didn't think. My first experience with Romans, and this is going to probably be very familiar to people who were in evangelicalism, was when I was 9 years old and a cemetery plot salesman. That part's not going to be the same for most people, but cemetery plot salesman selling cemetery plots to my grandparents, decided to evangelize, and my grandparents called us into the room, and I was given the Roman road of salvation.
Yep.
And so for those who don't know what that is, it's taking verses from Romans both out of context and out of order.
Yes.
To make a point.
Out of order. Yes. That's the other thing.
Yes. So, 1 minute we're talking about chapter 8, then he's going back over here to chapter 3 and all this other shit.
Yeah.
And it was basically the justification theory of how some scholars read Romans. And there are two different ways to read it: justification and sort of a universal salvation kind of way of reading it. And you can find that in textbooks like Bart Ehrman's really big textbook that I have on the New Testament and stuff like that. I was curious about who were the scholars. You've mentioned David Bentley Hart and Douglas Campbell. What other scholars did y'all look at, and why those scholars in particular?
Wait a minute.
Like, as far as like for this argumentation, like Lucy Pepiot, Chris Tilling, just people that I've come across and know, either Facebook friends or have talked to them. As far as the counter, like, yeah, you read like Sproul and you read N.T. Wright even I don't think agrees with Campbell's thesis necessarily, though he finds merit in the conversation. And I mean, like, this isn't a scholarly book, so this isn't going to be something you read at seminary. So it's not going to be like, these are all the arguments for, and that's not the point of the book. So we're not trying to prove the thesis. Like, we think that our thesis is really, if Paul's not read like this, it doesn't seem valuable outside of like historical curiosity to read Paul from any sort of place of authority, because he really is kind of contradictory and doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, he's kind of all over the place, really. Like, so if you want to call this the Word of God, it makes no sense to include Paul, because he's like, God would be much more clear if there was a clear biblical truth. Right. But if Paul is trying to lay out an argument from himself against others, like the scholars we went to that view it like that, I just chose them perfect from my standpoint based on the ones that I've read. Who I like, J. Louis Martin's another one, from Yale. Just the people that I've read, it's
is it Richard Beck? Is that his name?
Richard Beck. He's a psychologist, but yeah, I've him as well. Yeah, those are the main ones.
Yeah.
Well, there's a part in the book that that I want to read, because I think sometimes when we're reading these scriptures, the characters in the Bible are so far off from us that we don't see them as real people. At least that's how it is in my mind. But I identify with the phenomenology, and that's such a fun word.
Yeah.
The conscious coming into being and transition of being of Paul, and that is in this sub chapter, Difficulties Abound. I'm going to read it, and then I want to talk to you about it on the other side. It says, like everyone in the Bible, and indeed everyone who has ever lived, Paul was a human being having a subjective human experience. That's the part where I feel like we get lost sometimes when we're reading scripture, that we're dealing with humans, meaning Paul viewed everything through his own lens, and we need to allow him the space to develop as a thinker, as a writer, and as a theologian. After all, no one is born with perfect theology, nor do they ever develop it. I love that. For example, if Paul's eschatology shifts sometime between 1 Thessalonians and Romans, which it assuredly does, then we need to allow for such a change rather than trying to make everything fit. And I want to pause right there because Christians especially have a hard time with this. That's what apologetics is, right? Make everything fit. Sometimes that shit don't fit. It contradicts itself. You say something in one verse and in the next verse, it wipes out what came before it. Sometimes it don't fit. And what do you do when it doesn't fit? You acknowledge that and move the fuck on. But anyways, it says, these are letters, after all, coming from a man who undergoes quite a transformation. To begin, his upbringing leads him to become as devoutly religious as imaginable. In his own words, his history is that of a Hebrew born of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. Then bam, the Damascus Road event where everything seems to start anew. And I'm gonna pause right there. But I love that because that allows Paul to be a human. And a lot of the time, we're not reading the scriptures from the perspective that this is a growing, evolving, becoming believer. And so we think everything has to fit when in fact it doesn't have to fit. His experience as a believer is just as colorful as ours. You know what I'm saying? He went through a deconstruction himself. Multiple types of deconstruction. Like you said, he's the zealot. He is the religious, pious Jew. He is the persecutor of the church. And then he is this preacher under grace. He went through a lot. He went through a lot of transformation. And I think it helps to see him as this person who had the freedom to become a believer. If that makes sense.
I do want to point out one thing about the passage that she read that y'all got wrong. I have perfect theology.
We were thinking we should have considered you, Dillon. I'm sorry.
Desimber didn't read the footnote. There's a footnote.
Well, the footnote is
it's right here. It's right here on my wrist.
Yeah, Dillon.
Grace period.
Grace period. There you go.
Well, that might be Paul. That might be Paul's point too.
Well, and I believe you wrote that portion. So what do you have to say about that? The becoming of Paul, like it says, the phenomenology, the consciousness of him, the transition.
Yeah, I think even take it a step further, you could say, what about a transformation in Jesus? Like, did Jesus grow and learn and make mistakes? And I think when you start with like a perfect Bible, you don't allow for that. Again, you paint every passage as it has to be like some sort of literal truth, as if that's like the highest form of truth, rather than the truth that comes from getting it wrong, or the truth that comes from changing. And like, why can't Paul write a letter and then write a letter 5 years later that would like if I wrote a book in 2015 and then in 2020 and the theology is exactly the same, like I would have to question myself and my motivations. Like, did I not change at all? Would I not say it differently? Like, and so it seems like, I don't know, it seems like Paul changes maybe when he realizes like, okay, maybe the second coming isn't literally happening next week. Okay, well, Jesus is not bad. So maybe his eschatology has to change and it adapts, which is very Jewish. It adapts as you continue to relate to the life in front of you now, which is why Judaism is a progressive religion. So Paul undergoes this change, but he never becomes not Jewish. So it's this kind of juxtaposition that I think we can all be on. Like, if you're a Christian, be a Christian, but adapt and change. If you're a Buddhist, be a Buddhist, but don't be the same Buddhist in 5 years. And I think when we have a Bible that's not inerrant and infallible, it allows for that, which makes it a living text rather than a dead text, which is the book that I read for so many years. It was just a dead ancient text that I had no idea what the fuck was going on.
I love that. You said it becomes a living text. And here's the thing. Part of the first step in reading Romans right is understanding that these are human beings who got it wrong sometimes. It's understanding that this is not God. This is a person. this is not just a person, but this is a person living under the culture and ideology of the era in which he wrote those words. It's just the right application of what you're reading. That's something that's missing in the church as a whole, to me. The right application of what you're reading, and not trying to overlay 21st century existence on top of a 2,000-year-old document.
Yeah.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
I know you can attest to that, Keith, as far as
big time.
reading it right is understanding that some of these folks got it wrong.
And you know, and I have to say something about the title, because we've taken a little bit of heat for the title, like as if what we're saying is, you know, Paul, Matthew and I, we are the only ones that understand how to read Paul, so everybody just shut up and listen to us, right? Because we know how to read Romans right. And so in some of our interviews we've done, podcast interviews we've done about the book, and even just online interacting with people kind of push back on that. What we want to try to say is like, well, kind of two things. One, it's a little tongue in cheek, the reading Romans right. What we're really saying is that there definitely is a wrong way to read Romans. And that's what I grew up under, was the sort of wrong way of reading it. And we just want to correct that. We're trying to correct this way of teaching Paul that, I'm sorry, it's just, I think we make a really strong case, again, quoting other Pauline scholars who've done much more study and research into this than we have, that those were some wrong ways to teach Romans. Mm-hmm. But also that, again, understand that people like the Gospel Coalition and a lot of these guys that have huge YouTube channels and huge, you know, publishing deals in the evangelical conservative Christian world, they would say they're reading Romans right, and they would say there's only one way to read it. And so what we're trying to say is there are other ways of reading this text that even if you don't agree with our conclusions, you should at least be aware of them. You know, I mean, going back to you asked the question at the beginning, you know, what was the sort of the genesis, the inspiration for this book? So you remember Desimber, right? When I debated that guy, James White, right? That's where the whole blackest friend comes from, right? How can we forget? So during that debate, like at the end of the debate, there's a part where he and I are sitting at the same table and we're just asking each other questions back and forth. And again, James White, you know, everybody believes this guy is like, he's got it. He definitely understands the Bible. He's this incredible Bible scholar, and they live and die by what James White says, right? And so I asked him in that debate, I said, you're aware of prosopopoeia, right? What Paul is doing in Romans when he's writing from this prosopopoeia argumentation technique. And James White, and I was, you know, I'm inches away from the guy, so I could look in his eye. He really didn't know. He looked at me and he was like, no, I've never heard of that.
I didn't know either.
Yeah, well, but James White should know, right?
He's a theologian.
He's Dr. James White. He has a doctorate in theology, right? From the University of Phoenix or something. But he's...
That's not true.
But he's...
I didn't know University of Phoenix offered theology.
He's never heard of it, right? And so there was the realization, like, okay, there are these guys out there with doctor, in quotes, in front of their name, telling everybody how to read the Bible correctly, and he's never even heard of prosopopoeia. Like, I could have respect for him if he said, yes, I know what it is, I've looked at it, I just reject it. Then fine, but at least you're smart enough, you know, you're studied enough to understand it. And so understand that so many of these guys that are out there telling their congregations, telling people on their radio shows and their podcasts with thousands of listeners, this is the way to understand Romans. Most of these guys have never even heard of what we're talking about in this book.
Which is fine again, but it's like, I don't care. I don't know how to do a lot of shit, but I'm not going to argue I'm not going to spend my time debating that world and then not know the arguments.
Well, don't hold yourself up as an expert in something that you're not obviously an expert in because you haven't studied everything.
Even the scriptures say, study to show yourself approved.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Even the scriptures say that. I would never get the thing about most theologians or ministers or preachers or pastors is the hubris behind the perspective that my understanding is the understanding.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that I am doing whatever I'm doing is the right way to do it. there's some controversy. Let me give you an example. There's some controversy right now about a popular gospel artist who is also a pastor. And this person was raising an offering and told the ushers to close the doors and that they needed to raise $40,000 or whatever. There's a lot of debate about whether or not he would have did that, and if I was going to that church and this and that and that. And then they're on the other side of folks who are used to Black church culture. They're like, that's normal, da-da-da. You shouldn't talk on stuff you don't know about, this and that, that. My whole thing is just because something is normal doesn't make it right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
What in the hell makes you think that trapping people in the church to raise some more money is appropriate? And
Right.
what evidence in the scripture do you have of that? Now, I did not weigh in on the matter online because I don't got the energy and that it ain't important enough to me. But in the context of this, it reminds me of that because the arrogance, and then everybody falls in line behind that arrogance based on the pedestal that they have put the person on. See, because you couldn't be in a business setting and do such a thing. You couldn't be in a business setting and say, I'm not close the doors until everybody buys my product.
No.
Because technically that's what you're asking people to do. When you're
That's right.
asking for an offering, if you take it out of a spiritual realm, you're asking them to pay for a product or a service that
That's
they
right.
are partaking of, enjoying, want to support, whatever. You're asking them to pay for a product or a service, whether it's going to ministry or whatever. I'm talking about in the sense of a business.
That's right.
Because if you're raising a certain amount of money, you're raising it for a reason. So there's a business of ministry, which is just there, and it was there when Jesus walked the earth, and it's there now. They needed money to do ministry then, and they need money to do it now. So I understand that.
That's a big
But
part
what
of
makes you
Romans.
think it's acceptable just
Yeah.
because it's common? Something being common does not make it acceptable. Something being normal in a certain setting also does not make it acceptable.
Right.
And that reminds me of this man who is looked up to, who is honored, who is respected, who is touted as being this knowledgeable theologian with doctor in front of his name, and yet he did not know what the hell you were talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, thanks for that, Dee. One thing that my New Testament professor said in seminary is we have to hold our interpretations loosely.
Yes.
Because new information is going to come about and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But you mentioned prosopopia. I've heard it called other things. There's also the diatribe. And to me, I was having a hard time distinguishing between, or what is the difference between prosopopia, if I'm saying that right, and diatribe, because they both sound very similar. Is there a distinction? Are they almost synonymous?
From what I understand is like prosopopia is very specific to the time and place and includes techniques like diatribe. So I think Campbell's point would be like whether we call it prosopopia or not, whether we call it something else. Like I know when Paul uses something, I remember I got hit on something by a scholar that I called something like something Valcomer. And he's like, well, technically, it might not have been that because that might not have existed yet. It just might have looked similar to that Hebrew technique. So whether we call it that or not, what he's doing is laying out and argue like almost like a reductio ad absurdum. Okay, Dillon, you believe this. I'm going to show you where your argument goes. We're going to have a rhetorical argument about it, and you're going to see by the end of it why you're wrong and why I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
So whether that's technically, I think what Campbell says in his book, The Deliverance of God, will say that whether it's prosopopia or not, it looks like it and it takes on the form of these things, which include diatribe and other things.
Okay.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think what we're also trying to point out in the book is, in addition to that argumentation technique, right, diatribe, prosopopia, exactly, whatever you call it, but just to point out the fact that there is an overarching point that Paul is making in this letter, okay? And I think we point this out in the book, that there's one of the problems with the way I've seen Romans handled growing up in an evangelical Christian church and sitting under pastors teaching or preaching from Romans, is how often they just take little tiny snippets of it, right? A little part of a chapter, and they'll base this whole argument on this one little part. But when you do that, you are ignoring the fact, like, no, that is just one little brick in this whole wall that Paul is trying to build, and you're missing it, right? It's like literally missing the forest for the trees, right? You're focusing on one little tree or one leaf on one tree, and you're not pulling back to notice this bigger thing that's happening. And I think when you do that, if you can actually notice that, and hopefully if you read the book, we do a good job of showing you that, this bigger picture, you kind of see that what Paul starts to do in chapter 1 and continues to do throughout, he really comes to like a crescendo at the end of chapter 11. And then everything afterwards is like, we've been talking about, like, if Romans had ended at the end of chapter 11, it would hopefully be more obvious to people. We'd be like, oh, he made the point, the end.
Oh, Paul's a universalist.
Yes, Paul's a universalist, I guess, right? Because that's kind of the ending point at the end of chapter 11. And then 12 is just sort of like, well, now what, right? Now, how should we, if everyone's going to be in view of God's mercy, he says, in view of this such great mercy of God, then how should we live? Well, in other words, if everyone gets saved, then why be a Christian, right? That's the question I get all the time when I talk about universalism. So,
Right.
12 is answering that question. And what about the state? Well, let's talk about the state for a little bit. And then, he goes and deals with some other questions as well, but as he's just kind of working his way out of the letter. But again, it's because it's a letter. It's not, primarily, Paul isn't trying to write a sermon, right? That just ends, boom, drop the mic, pass the plate.
Bring up the band.
Yeah. If that's what he was doing, then he probably would have ended at 11. But because it's a letter, right, then he's got, okay, I got other business, other things I need to deal with, other questions I need to answer, like about, eating food sacrificed to idols and all these other things that he knows that they're struggling with. But yeah, we just want to point out that Romans, there's a lot going on in Romans, and we can't just sort of.
And I think our point would be, like, you don't have to be a universalist to be a Christian, but Paul was.
Paul was.
Right. Yeah.
Understand that Paul was. Yeah.
I really think he was. I'm convinced that he was. If anyone in the Bible was universalist, Paul was.
I am too. I mean, other letters that he wrote. One of the things that's really important for people who are listening and watching to understand is that it was a letter. Paul, I think that the Apostle Paul would have been absolutely horrified to find out that 2,000 years later, people were calling his letters the Bible.
Yes,
right.
I agree.
And that they were contextual to their time and place. And yes, we can get some theological insights and truth out of them. But if you're going to put John Calvin's glasses on and read it, you're going to come away with a God who is, quite frankly, can go get fucked, because I don't want anything to do with that God. Mm-hmm. Any God that would arbitrarily say, you know what, there's going to be a guy named Dillon in the 20th and 21st centuries, and I'm just going to create him so he can go to hell.
And that's going to glorify me too.
Oh, it'd be so much glory.
And that's going to make me feel so good. Man, no.
Yes.
And I'd love that David Bentley Hart quote about Calvinism being basically the polar opposite of what Christianity is. So I did appreciate the 30,000 foot view of Romans that you talk about, because it's like that Roman road of salvation. If you just start pulling stuff out of there, like they do all the time with Romans 1, 26 and 27.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And you don't know the context, that there are different ways of seeing that. Like you guys talked about the ritual prostitution.
Oh yeah.
And stuff like that. Some scholars say that it's doesn't have anything to do with homosexuality that we call it today, but just the inordinate amount of sex that people were having, because Paul was one of those people who believed that it depleted you.
Yeah.
So that might be why he was a celibate. I think he was asexual myself, but
Paul seems to be anti-sex. If Paul's anti-sex, he's anti-sex, not gay, straight. He's just don't get married. He's pointless. Like
don't get married.
He's anti-intimacy. Period.
It seems like
he was a fan of songs.
Maybe he was ace, maybe he was aro. I don't know, but And maybe he didn't like the idea of male on male, same gendered sex, or women doing it or whatever. But I still don't think that that's a for all time, because I walked through my neighborhood today. I didn't see a single sex temple.
No.
No. There were no temples where people were, coming telling me that if I came in here and had sex with the oracle, that I would find out something, or that I could go rent a I mean, in that day and age, there was a lot of really heinous, what we would call heinous stuff going on.
There's pedophilia,
children, and
all
kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, but see, again, like what we say in the book is that part of this is one of the problems, right, with Romans chapter 1, is that Romans chapter 1 is handled as itself. That Romans chapter 1 is even a thing. That there is no Romans 1 without Romans 2. And the point of everything he's doing in chapter 1 is really to set his readers up for this big, like, aha, I gotcha moment in chapter 2.
Yeah, it's right? Admiral Akbar. It's a trap.
It's a trap. That's exactly. Romans 1 is the trap. Romans 2 is the I gotcha. But see, again, if you never read Romans from the wider angle, the wider view, you come away thinking, yep, that's it. It's just Romans chapter 1. That's all it is.
And historical Paul may be against some of those things in Romans 1:18 through 32. But I don't think that's his point. It's like the point is like,
right.
You say everyone does this, you do that. So who the hell are you?
That's right.
That's kind of,
you're condemned as well. That's
if you want to focus on the things he's saying at the start, that's kind of to miss the point of the whole bit.
Yeah,
right.
You're falling into this trap.
That was one of the points in one of my biblical interpretation classes in seminary, was that the professor said, look, that number 2 there doesn't mean anything. Just pretend it's not there and keep reading.
Right.
Because then you'll get to the point that Paul is trying to make, is that the Gentiles might sin differently than you do, or they might sin the same as you do, but everybody's sinning. And so everybody needs grace. Kind of like Jesus said.
Kind of seems
that's a good segue. And as we get ready to wrap up, we normally wrap our show up with good news and word on the street. And I think this portion that I'm going to read encompasses both good news and word on the street. And that is in chapter 10 of the book. And let me just say again, y'all go get the book, Reading Romans Right, because we need to be informed.
You can get it on
around
Kindle
here.
as well.
That's right. On all your digital platforms. In chapter 10, and this one is in view of God's mercy. And so in light of the fact that we normally close out the show with good news and with word on the street, I think this is appropriate. And also it speaks to the fact that how the Bible can be used, the dichotomy between it being a beating or being a blessing, depending on who's handling this, whether it is used to encourage and empower or abuse and oppress people, because the same one that wrote the scriptures that people use to abuse people and oppress and shun and ostracize is the same one that wrote about mercy and grace. And so it's what does it transform into? What is the phenomenology? That's going to be my Sesame Street word of the day of the person who's holding the book. What does it become in the hand of the reader, right? Mm-hmm. Who does Paul become? And if you're reading it right, he is going to become a merciful, evolving believer. If you're reading it from the perspective of an all-powerful, punishing and oppressing God, he is going to be your crusader for Christian nationalism, if you will, or whatever you want to make him to be. But I want to read this, and this is in chapter 10, in view of God's mercy. It says, immediately after Paul's victory celebration, at the end of Romans 11, where he extols the extravagant depths of God's love and grace in showing mercy to everyone and everywhere, he poses the question, if everyone is saved, what's the point? His answer is simple, yet difficult to master. Therefore, I implore you, brothers and sisters, by God's mercies, to present your bodies as a living, holy, acceptable sacrifice to God, which is your rational act of worship. And in the scriptures that I grew up hearing, it would say it's your reasonable service.
Yes.
And do not be configured to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of the intellect, or the renewing of your mind, so you may test the will of God, which is good and acceptable and perfect. And then the book goes on to say, so because God's plan is to imprison all in disobedience so that he may be merciful to all, Paul asked the church to respond by submitting their whole life to the glory of God, as this is an appropriate, rational act of worship for those who are the recipients of such an excessively generous outpouring of God's boundless love. Our response should be to surrender ourselves to the will of God, which is good, acceptable, and perfect. And our minds should be reconfigured to this new way of understanding who God is, and subsequently who we are. The ultimate act of metanoia is when our minds are transformed and renewed by the reality of God's graciousness to us all. I really like that. And then I'll just read this last part, and then the rest of it, y'all got to read. Y'all got to go buy the books.
You got to buy the rest.
Yeah, you got to buy the rest. You get $1.99, and then the rest you get in 4 installments of $19.99, 4 easy payments. Anyways, it says, not only should we respond by submitting ourselves as living sacrifices to the God of love and mercy, we should also find ourselves driven to an unprecedented level of humility. And that's what's missing in my mind. That's what keeps people from reading Paul right, is the humility. As Paul says, for by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. So I want to leave y'all with that thought as far as it concerns reading Romans right, which is easy to do if you're coming as an open book yourself when you open this book. If you're coming with an open heart as you explore the heart of Paul. If you're coming with an open mind as you explore the evolution of Paul's faith and his relationship with a God that he has had an encounter with. And to understand this is just another human being who is having a spiritual experience just like you. Mm-hmm. And I think when we get to see Paul as a human having a spiritual experience, evolving in his relationship with God, and we're looking at that through a lens of humility, grace, mercy, and a willingness to understand, it is impossible to use the book of Romans as a weapon.
I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate the way y'all took the hammer out of the hand of the reader.
Yeah.
Because what was it? The dropping the hammer on their head.
Yeah.
And we didn't get into it, but that passage we could have gone Girardian about a living sacrifices. So many Christians want to talk about the sacrifice of Jesus, and it seems that God really wants a living sacrifice, which is some language that can flip things on its head and removes a lot of that language from God that Calvinists just can't help but get back into.
Yeah,
absolutely. So look, tell the people, Matt, where can people find you? Where can they get the book? What you want people to know? Shout it out.
Well, for me, I mean, just if you like hearing from Keith and I, the Heretic Happy Hour, wherever you subscribe to the God Squad, you can subscribe to the Heretic Happy Hour. You can find me on all the socials. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and some TikTok. Look me up. You'll find me.
He's like, I'm out here. I'm in the streets.
Yeah, I'm here.
Well, Mr. Keith Giles, our resident old white dude and amazing author and talented teacher. Where can people find you, more about you, this book, all your other books, my goodness, and link up with you on social media?
Too many books, this guy.
Yeah, lots of books. Yeah. I got one coming out in 2 months, but we'll talk about that now.
I'm so sick of you. Have I told you that?
I am too.
I'm not just sick. I'm sick and tired of you.
I understand.
And I admire you so much. I'm sick of you at the same time.
Well,
anyways, go ahead.
My books are on Amazon. Just, you can search Keith Giles. You'll find my books there. I blog on Patheos at keithgiles.com. It takes you straight to my blog there. And as Matt said, I'm on Heretic Happy Hour. Sometimes I do Second Cup with Keith podcast. It's my solo podcast. And yeah, I'm on socials. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, all that. So happy to connect.
That second cup's going to get a lot more expensive with these tariffs.
Oh, I know.
Coffee's going to get more expensive.
The
Christian crack is going to get expensive.
I could only afford that first cup. I am so sorry.
Yeah, I know. I understand.
That second cup might not make the budget cut, honey.
The second cup might be just water.
Yeah, it did literally.
In the office, that second drink. When the ice melts, then you got the second drink.
That's your second cup.
That's the second cup. That's the cup. You got anything, Dillon? Dillon, you got anything for the people as we wrap it up?
Just next week, we're going to have another special guest, Dr. Angela Danker. Doctor, right? I got that right.
I believe that is right. I'm excited about that.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about her book, Disciples of White Jesus, Radicalization of American Boyhood. So check that out next week.
Wow.
And also check us out on Sirius XM Progress, channel 127 with John Fugelsang on Tell Me Everything, or the John Fugelsang podcast, which he releases the next day if you don't have Sirius XM.
All right. Thank you to all our faithful, our listening faithful for tuning in. Like, share, subscribe, tag somebody, all that good stuff. Leave us a good review. And listen, we'll be right back here next week if the good Lord says the same and this country doesn't go off into a clip of apocalypse or Armageddon. I don't know, but we'll try to be here next week. You know what I'm saying? So if we're here, we'll be here with you next week. 2 p.m.
Romans right.
Thank y'all for tuning in on tonight. And we'll see you this time next week. Same bad time, same bad channel.
All right.